Greetings, primitive humans. I come to you from the future. In the future, we are all. In the future, love-sex relations are all. One may make love to all things at all times in all possible forms and ways. In the future, we live inside of Wal Mart, all of us. Many of us crammed, packed into various aisles. Each aisle contains a small sleeping module which rolls out. Aisles are filed according to one's chosen fictional LARPing creature. I myself am a rat. I am the Pope of the future. I'm the Pope in the future. And in the future, all of our food is provided directly from central Wal Mart locales. Some people choose to live inside of a Starbucks. Some people choose to live inside of a Target. Others have chosen the Google City lifestyle. I, being from the South, live inside of a Walmart. But my aisle is one of the most respected aisles in Walmart.
I am the Pope of the future. I'm the Pope in the future.
I live inside of the vending aisle wherein all French fries are distributed to all those who live in my skyrise Walmart. In the future, we only eat fries, genetically modified fries. As you can see, I'm wearing. In this video, we're going to explain to you how your life is going to be changed, primitive. Stop picking fleas, ape. Hey, ape. Young ape there. Why are you throwing your fecal matter? Why are you tossing your scat, ape? Primitive monkey brains. Primitive ape, I'm speaking to you with your genitalias. Ugh. As you strive to understand the words I speak to you with your chemical soup, primordial chemical soup brain, sorry, I am immediately linked to all creatures, and I just made love to 23 dragons at this moment. Pardon me, I was making dragon love, which you can't fathom. Virtually, I have a virtual hook in, which you won't fathom. I'm here to discuss this book with you, friend. Primitive ape friend. Allow me to speak it to your language. Does that translate for you, primitive? I'm going to explain to you what one of the prophets of the old days of the New Order said to you. He laid out for you each stage and phase of where you would be going into this glorious, brave new future with Mr. Wells. I hope it translates for you, primitive. Let's launch now into an explanation of globalist books. Our great forefathers in the new order, the globalists. Our great prophets and sages of the new religion. And yes, he calls it a new religion. And let's translate this to your primitive monkey brains, little primitives, little chimps, little gorillas, gorillas in the mist, gorillas in the mist. Peace. H.G. Wells, Masonic Illuminist, open conspirator. That's what we're going to talk about today, is his book, The Open Conspiracy. Now, a lot could be said here, and you may think that in my initial comedy sketch there, me being ridiculous, that I was joking about the future religion and so forth. And we're going to see that that's unfortunately not the case. H.G. Wells literally believes that what he's presenting is a new religion, and he talks about this very openly in the book, as we'll see. Before we get into that, though, this is, of course, the partial talk for free. If you want to hear the full talks and full videos and see the full recommendations, you can go to jasonalsos.com and subscribe for $60 a year for $4.95 a month. And you can also get my book, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, which has over 100 five-star reviews, maybe one day 500 five-star reviews. But the book actually has an entire chapter on H.G. Wells and the globalist writings. And as you know, if you follow my work, we're doing the Globalist Books series. We're going through actual book after book after book of the globalists. We did, of course, Tragedy and Hope last year. In totality, all 1,300 pages, 16 hours of lecture, which you can subscribe to at Jason Alsos. First hours are free. The full 16 hours is, of course, by subscription only. We did Bertrand Russell's Scientific Outlook last week, or a couple weeks ago. Before that, we did Miles Copeland's Game of Nations. You can find that talk, famous CIA operative. Before that, we did Brzezinski's Grand Chessboard, and we did Brzezinski's Between Two Ages. You can find those books and those talks as well. And we did the Anglo-American Establishment of Dr. Carol Quigley. And so this week we turn to The Open Conspiracy. And, you know, a lot of these books some of them I had read years ago, not all of them. Some of them I had read parts of over the years. For example, Bertrand Russell, if you do a college course or try to do philosophy in grad or undergrad like I did, you will come in contact with various writings of Bertrand Russell. So I had read Why I'm Not a Christian and some of his pieces on logic. I was less familiar with his more cultural commentary and so forth, and so that's why we did Scientific Outlook, which we saw was quite monstrous. And what we get with H.G. Wells, the famous science fiction writer, right, War of the Worlds, Island of Dr. Moreau, which, again, I have analyses of all those as well. Analyses of Time Machine. What we get here is a propagandist. So if you remember from the Quigley talks, there was the outer circle of those involved in the real conspiracy, and they were the members of the Royal Society, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, a few thousand of those, if you recall from the Quigley books. The inner circles were Rothschild, right, these characters, according to Quigley. This is the origins of the CFR, Trilateral Commission, and all that, hence the Brzezinski books and so forth. So many, many more globalist books to go. I'm knocking them out, again, one by one, week by week. We did take a brief detour last week and did the talk on the New Testament and God's existence. So got a great response on that. I wish I'd had a little more traction, but the feedback was all 95% positive. So if you want to catch up on those, you can. Of course, all the talks stand alone. They don't have to go together, but most of what's coming in the next year, I don't mean from now to December, I mean the next year, as in the next 12 months. I mean, we're going to really cover a lot of globalist books. Arthur Koestler's Ghost in the Machine is another important one that we're going to cover. And that one actually ties into this, what we're doing today. And I think the most important thing to begin with is that what H.G. Wells is a propagandist.
first and foremost, I would say. I mean, yeah, he in a ways, he's an intellectual of a sort. I mean, he's kind of a thinker, but not anything like what you would get in, a Bertrand Russell or a, one of the more serious scientific or scientistic or philosophical thinkers. I mean, Wells is intelligent, but again, he's more of a propagandist and a fiction writer. I mean, that's what he's known for. But again, he does have these very blatant books that deal with the New World Order. And so when we look at the open conspiracy today, we're going to see that, I mean, the things that are admitted are just astounding, really. I mean, you really need to be familiar with this material to understand what's going on here. So we're talking about somebody here with Wells that is in that outer circle of the people who are the outer portico of the conspiracy, according to Quigley. That's his language. And then, of course, the inner circle and the junta. Wells is one of the propagandists of the kind of the outer circle, in my view. He's a true believer. He believes that the New World Order is going to be utopia, that it's going to be a scientific dictatorship that will raise man as a phoenix from the ashes, to use his terminology. And this New World Order is the phoenix from the ashes. I mean, whoever put this eye on this edition of the book was correct. I mean, that's really what we're looking at here. Wells was a high-level Freemason and was very open, very, very much a proponent of all the ideas of Marxism, of socialism, communitarianism. But what we're going to see in this book is that he has very penchant and serious criticisms of Marxism that distinguish his scientific technocracy from classical Marxism. So he's not a classical Orthodox Marxist. He's more of an evolved Marxist, the modern version of a Marxist, which is, of course, the globalist, the technocrat. So H.G. Wells is the model technocrat. We saw this with the character Brzezinski as we analyzed his books as well. Here we have, again, somebody in the circles of the Huxleys, in the circles of the British elite back in the 30s. This is a couple years, 1935. This is a couple years after Brave New World is published. Right, it's just a few years after Bertrand Russell's Scientific Outlook is published. So again, this is another one of these testaments, another one of these examples, another famous person who is a testament to this completely open plan. And what's amazing about this book is that the title of the book is about how their plan is open. It's an open conspiracy. Now, to all you haters out there, it's called a conspiracy. So there are real conspiracies. Here's proof. This one is called open. Now, if you don't know about this, then it's probably just because you're ignorant. If you do know about it, then if you actually believe this, you're duped. There's no way this is going to be for your good. And as we'll see, I mean, he's even going to say, yeah, a lot of people, unfortunately, are just going to have to die as a result of this, right? They're going to have to die fighting for family and for country. And family and country are going the way of the dustbin. They're going to their grave. We're going to destroy family and nation, H.G. Wells says. And he sees those things as linked. All old ideas are going the way of the trash bin, garbage, juice, smoothies, according to H.G. Wells. So we're going to look at how this is a psychological warfare operation, which he says very early on in the first few pages. And he says that just like Russell, modern advanced technology is making the world global. This will lead to a centralization of all power, of all resources, and of total and complete control. He says the masses are ignorant to big-scale changes. The world is being globalized. They won't even notice it. Monopoly capitalism, he says interestingly, is going to be the means by which the global order will be erected. Then capitalism will be discarded as useless. Capitalism, according to Wells, was just a phase to take us to the global order. Out of that global order will come the phoenix from the ashes, the New World Order, which will be the completely controlled, managed, technocratic society, right, based around the religion of scientism. In fact, he is going to say that the new religion is the New World Order. In other words, the philosophy that he's putting forward in this book will be the new religion. You will sing hymns, he says, to the New World. You will sing hymns to the New World Order. Step into the New World Order. Wade out a little bit deeper. H.G. Wells and Satan are going to save your soul. Literally, he says that you're going to sing these kinds of songs. Not that one. That's stupid. But he's saying that, when this is erected, everyone will see that this is the real religion, and you'll worship humanity collectively will be the new God. Literally. And he says you'll realize that you as an individual don't have meaning or significance, and that really it's only the collective human race that is worthy of worship. And of course, that's all going to be controlled, and it's going to be decided who's going to be born until the time when the babies are born out of the test tubes. Literally, he says, until we get the test tube babies, the GMO babies, the world government will just have to decide all the levels of population in different countries and continents. So this is just a taste of what we're talking about here. Phase 1 is the ending of the family and the ending of patriotism, and the use of class warfare to stoke these forces, to stoke this change. That's phase 1. But just wait until I tell you what phase 2, 3, and 4 are, according to New World Order propagandist H.G. Wells in his Luciferian Order. So if you want to watch the rest of this talk, as we said, you can subscribe to Jay's Analysis. But this is just the introduction, just the taste. And then, of course, subscribers get access to the full talk. You can also check out my show, Hollywood Decoded, at the Gaia Network, Gaia.com, where Jay Widener and I decode Hollywood's biggest films. Thank you for watching, and go ahead and check out the full talk. Welcome to the subscribers section. So we mentioned that H.G. Wells talked about the spread of global monopoly capital. What Wells lays out at the beginning of Open Conspiracy is the problem of population. And population is a problem because all reality in this philosophy, much like the philosophy of Lenin or any of the communists or Mao, is flux. All reality is in perpetual flux. There's nothing true, nothing stable, nothing objective, nothing fixed, no metaphysical principles or absolutes. All is evolution and change. Of course, this never applies to their actual philosophy, right? Evolution itself never evolves, but that's okay. They're not interested in being consistent because what they're selling is a worldview. They're selling a replacement philosophy and ideology for the older values of the West and of the Bible and so forth. The masses miss big change, he says, and this has led to, through monopoly capitalism and the rise of healthcare and medicine and sanitation and diets and so forth in his day, to a vast rise in population. As a result, this has led to more families, and the family is dangerous because the family is a transmitter of tradition. The family is also a transmission of patriotism because the tribe is just a larger extension of the family, your people group, your nation, most of the time, not necessarily all modern nations, which are structured around propositional Republican abstractions, but traditionally speaking, nations were connected to family in many ways. This is why monarchies formed, was because family was the central locus of how societies were organized. That has all been done away with, according to Wells. And this is the revolutionary program, he says on pages 8 and 9. This is the progressive. Right? So in his day, progressive means what he's talking about. There are great dangers to the New World Order. there are great dangers to be avoided as a result of the New World Order. And those great dangers are the world wars. So the world war that he had just experienced in 1914, World War I, he says that the only way we're going to avoid that is through the erection of scientific dictatorship, technocracy. And the Soviet model, which he says is an experiment, the 5-year plan of Stalinism in 1926 to 1928, this plan that was started is a managed society that will bring, he believes and he hopes, the future utopia. So Wells is very hopeful and very has a very positive assessment of the experiment, which he and Bertrand Russell called the Soviet exportation an experiment to reorganize and restructure Russia. The New World Order is a culmination of the Enlightenment, according to Wells in Chapter 3. This requires a change of mind. Modern man has to change his mind and accept the new, or what I call the fetish of the new. This is as a result of nominalism, the early medieval rise from Abelard and Occam and other so-called philosophers of the notion that there's no abstract concepts or principles, there's only flux. And as a result, words don't really have consistent meaning. Platonism, that's all connected to ancient ideas of Platonism and Christianity. That must be tossed out for bare empiricism. And this is what he learned in his Masonic philosophy, H.G. Wells that is. And we have to adopt pragmatism, he says on page 18. And while it's unfortunate, what we learn from these great wars is that the only way to avoid these great global conflicts is through global government. He doesn't mention that the banksters are the ones engineering the wars, which is what Quigley says in Treasure and Hope. All forms of conservatism and must go, and what is introduced is a new form of conservation, which will focus on the environment. So here you have, again, just like Bertrand Russell, many decades prior to the Club of Rome documents. The science of life, quote unquote, will totally revolutionize all areas of life. In other words, full spectrum dominance will come into play. And this change of mind will lead, in Chapter 4, he says, to a change in educational procedures and pedagogy. All forms of old education are backwards. Everything old will be viewed as backwards and need to be updated. So the first places to go for understanding Wells's attack plan is mass media, propaganda, and education. Right? How many years have we been saying this? Religions, he says, are the next to be affected and changed. They have to be changed. And that's because everything is evolving. And so while old religions sought a first cause, Wells argues that the apologetic arguments of the classical tradition of classical theists have all failed because they don't prove a personal God, they prove a generic first cause, which is meaningless. And guess what? H.G. Wells is correct that the bad Western Thomistic arguments don't prove anything. And in fact, they are detrimental to the cause of theism. They're worse for the cause of theism than they would like to admit. Why? Because they don't prove a meaningful God, right? If your apologetic argument is proving, supposedly, quote unquote, or trying to put into play the same kind of God that a Muslim would argue for, or a Hindu would argue for, or a Mormon would argue for, you really have surrendered your apologetic endeavor. Because what happens is that the God that you're arguing for is himself cloaked behind abstract principles like, quote, causality that you think are more certain than God himself. The problem is that the God that's presented in the Bible is not less certain than causality, some abstraction. Causality could only occur, right? Causality is a precondition for the kind of God that exists in the Bible. In other words, without God's existence, there could be no causality, period. So the argument has things backwards. You can't argue from generic abstract principles, which are not empirical, and try to argue with an empiricist that these abstract principles somehow prove a first cause. You don't understand who you're arguing with. Who you're arguing with doesn't believe in abstract principles. So if you're going to try to argue and prove an abstract principle with them, which I'm not saying is wrong necessarily, you can't do an apologetic that is separate from your theology, is what I'm trying to say. Your apologetic methodology has to be informed by the theology that you hold. And Orthodox theology, Christian theology, does not hold that there's such a thing as a generic God. There's not. There's only the Father, right, revealed in the Son and in the Spirit. So Wells says that these bad arguments, these bad teleological arguments and cosmological arguments and causal arguments from Aquinas don't prove anything, and they lead to atheism. And he's right. That's why St. Gregory Palamas 700 years ago said the exact same thing and anticipated and predicted. He told Barlaam, when Barlaam was giving all these same bad arguments, he says, you're going to give your whole future of the West atheism. This is where this argumentation will lead. And I've stressed this, I don't know how many times. Just read the debate between St. Gregory and Barlaam. No, the Thomists don't understand this. They can't grasp this. The Roman Catholics can't grasp this. And I'm sorry that this is difficult to hear. But if once you do understand this, you'll understand why the system doesn't work. Right? Hellenism cannot be coupled with Christianity to provide some sort of intellectual framework or some sort of social framework. Hellenism has to be rejected. This is the whole point of the Maccabees. This is why the Maccabees are included in the canon. Well, there's other reasons, but the book of the Maccabees is part of the biblical canon because not only does it vindicate what Jesus says about the destruction of the temple and the abomination of desolation in 1 Maccabees 1 and 2, and then cross-reference with Luke 21 and 17 and Matthew 24, the book of Maccabees also shows the danger of Hellenism for God's people. Now, every one of the heresies of the first 8 centuries of the church, 9 centuries of the church, is based in Hellenism. Okay, Marcionism is based in Hellenism and Gnosticism. Adoptionism is based in Hellenism and Gnosticism. Arianism is based in Hellenism and Gnosticism. Right? Nestorianism is based in Hellenism. Origenism is based in Hellenism and Platonism. And this is what the fathers argue. St. Athanasius argues this in his writings, that he's battling Hellenism and Platonism and Greek philosophy. So what's happened is a lot of people have, and I didn't understand this for a long time, right? I spent my whole 20s trying to figure this out. What happens in the confusion is that people are confused. Here's the source of the confusion. People are confusing Greek terms with Hellenism. Okay, and what the terms so in other words, what the terms represent is what's at issue here. Even St. Jerome says this, that the point is what the concepts. The point is not the words, right? Whether it's a Greek word or a Hebrew word. The point is what it's referring to, the truths and the concepts that are being referred to in the statements. So when we see, for example, I always go to this example from Exodus 3, I am that I am. Okay, every Thomist, read Etienne Gilson, Spirit of Medieval Philosophy, every Thomist interprets this to be a statement about super-existent being. I am super-existent being. And it's also a similarity to the divine essence in Thomism. It's a statement, it doesn't line up perfectly to the divine essence, but it's an analogia. It's an analogy to the divine essence, right? So that doesn't work because that's not traditional theology. Orthodox theology, traditional theology, the theology of the first 8 councils is not Hellenism, and it's not a statement about analogy to the divine essence. There's nothing in the created order at all that has any similarity to the divine essence. And Paul says that in Acts 17 very clearly. So what Paul's arguing against in Acts 17 could in many ways be analogous to the pattern of the encounter and danger that the church has to deal with for the next 1,000 years, the first millennium of the church, in battling Hellenism. So I am that I am is a statement of personal covenantal relationship. It is not a statement of Greek philosophical metaphysics. That's the first point of that's the essence of it. That's the point of departure here. This is why I ended up rejecting Thomism, right? Once you understand that, you will reject Thomism. Now, how do you get to that conclusion? Well, first of all, read your Bible, okay? Read the Old and the New Testaments. Read it many times through. Read the Book of Maccabees and the Deuterocanon. Read these many times through, and just because it's the Septuagint is not Hellenism, okay? All of this and all of these heresies are the rejection of Hellenism. The first whole volume of God, History, and Dialectics by Dr. Farrell, back when he would do theology books, that whole book is dedicated to making this point. Making the point about Hellenism and the encounter and battle with Hellenism. Again, St. Athanasius makes this point in many of his arguments, in many of his writings. So you have all these early church dudes, heretics. Eunomius is a great example. Very influenced by Platonism or Aristotle, but more so Platonism for the most part. So the church fathers are having to deal with this and constantly, for centuries, do tens of thousands of pages of apologetics against Hellenism. And the assumptions of Hellenism are things like the idea that generic being is an analogy for God, right? That the monad of Plato is in many ways analogous to or matches up to the biblical idea of God. So if we can just kind of use some of these Aristotelian arguments about a first cause, well, guess what? Aristotle believes that first cause is thought thinking itself, right? It's an unknowable, unrelatable, impersonal thought form. So that has nothing to do with the biblical God. So the phrase God exists or God is the first cause it is true in itself, right? But that doesn't mean that because Aristotle says God exists that we adopt Aristotle. You can't, right? I'm saying the philosophy as a whole, you can't. Now, no Thomist adopts philosophy of Aristotle as a whole, but there is a large attempt to synthesize Plato and Aristotle and the classical tradition. And so really it's a question of what works and what doesn't work. And if these attempts at synthesizing were relegated to, aspects of culture or something like that, that might be debatable. That would be one thing. But when it comes to the doctrine of God, no. All right. So we have to take our theology, our philosophy, our triadology, and our Christology from what's revealed in Scripture first and foremost, and that's what you see the church fathers do for the first 1,000 years. When you read Athanasius's arguments, when you read Basil's arguments, when you read St. Gregory of Nyssa's arguments, when you read St. Maximus Confessor's arguments, all of which went into influencing the decisions of the councils, those arguments are not made on the basis of Hellenism. They're made on, I would say, 80 to 85% of the time on the basis of Scripture. You will at times have philosophical arguments made, which is, that's not a problem. There's some philosophical argumentation used, for example, in the essence-energy distinction. But that principle is actually laid out in Scripture. Paul talks about a distinction between the hypostasis, he uses this Greek term, and the energeia, energies of the Spirit, the operations of the Spirit. So ideas that are, or principles or terms that are in Scripture can be laid out in a more fuller sense, in the councils and the fathers. But the point being that in all of this is just that H.G. Wells is really following in the train of a long trend of philosophy that is so wrapped up in dialectics that it can't solve a lot of its own problems. And these dialectics result from the starting point. That's the whole point here. The starting point of Thomism and the starting point of Hellenism are the same, and that's why they have to be rejected. Because they lead ultimately to atheism when you follow through consistently with it. Many Thomists do not follow consistently through with it, and that's why many of them, do have good points, and they make they have insights here and there, and they're useful. I spent many years in this tradition and this view, so I understand it. But it's really a question of being confronted with horns of a dilemma within a system, and which path are you going to go down. Anyway, so Wells is pretty candid about all this, is what I'm saying in chapter 5 about God and God's existence, and bad arguments like the classic bare-faced cosmological argument, which is really a bad argument, by the way. There are many ways to disprove that. First of all, it doesn't show that there's no... in other words, why could there not be turtles all the way down? So you're going to say that is irrational and incoherent on what basis? Maybe the world is just structured that way. This is the kind of argument that you're going to get from atheists. And I'm not saying that I think that that's true, but I'm saying that once you started on the foundation of arguing that there's a generic principle of causality that is the most certain thing that you go to then back up or prove God, you've messed up. That's the point. Because causality becomes more certain than God, an abstract principle. There is no abstract principle of causality that you observe that's more certain than God. That's your problem. And you don't see that, and that's because all Thomism and most Roman Catholicism post-Renaissance, I guess, is grounded in the ideas of classical foundationalism, right? So until Thomists can figure out how to question classical foundationalism, they're going to be lost and running in a circle. Since H.G. Wells realizes that in his philosophy there's no such thing as a fall, and that there is no eternity, there's only time. Therefore, everything in his paradigm, in his philosophy, is reoriented, and that's absolutely true. It's another reason why, just like with Hellenism, you can't blend Christianity and evolutionary materialism, which a lot of idiots try to do. That's just going to again lead to the destruction and the end of your faith and your tradition. If you want your descendants, if you want to hand down theistic evolution and all this kind of nonsense to your descendants, who will within a few generations figure out that this is inconsistent and probably opt for the atheism and evolution route, that's up to you. But if you want to be that foolish, that's your choice, that's your decision to be that foolish. But when your great-great-grandkids are social justice, GMO, Medusa creatures of the future, that's on you, because you didn't have the guts to actually look into the possibility of Darwinism being wrong, and you just wanted to follow bogus religious leaders who've been telling you that evolution and Christianity are the same. So the idea of Wells here is that religions have to evolve and will just basically be an adjunct of the New World Order. So pretty common sense there. We know, we figured he would say that. But he has this weird argument that I haven't noticed before, where these guys, because he is an illuminist, he is in that tradition of Weishaupt, right, of communism, of global communism, Antonio Gramsci. These are the Buonarroti. These are the successors to Weishaupt. And I think that Wells makes it clear in his books that he is a successor in that tradition. As to how far he was initiated into, quote, Illuminism, I'm not sure, but being a high-level Freemason, I think, and basically regurgitating everything that Adam Weishaupt said, I think we can safely assume that he is in the Illuminist tradition. And he says that what we're going to do is take all these ideas from Christianity and just reorient them and repackage them into the global religion, the global psychoanalytical religion. He says that the sacrifice of the individual in religion will be turned to the world socialist order. So whereas you might have given yourself over to something like the church in the past, now you're going to give yourself over in religious devotion to the world socialist order. That's literally what he says. That's not my imposing upon the text, right? That's literally what he says. He has another chapter on religion where he says that Religion's produced a lot of positive things that aren't going to be good for the New World Order. So that's going to have to be tweaked and monitored and shifted. And instead of everybody focusing on the afterlife and being prepared for that, it's all going to shift to this life and focus on this world and focus on making this world better. So the religions, the churches, are going to be tweaked into social gospel. And this is the liberalism of the 20s, 30s, 40s that basically transformed all churches, right? And for the most part, especially all the Protestant churches, and then eventually the Roman Catholic Church, to where the message is no longer sin, repentance, redemption, belief in resurrection, and so forth. It's social justice. Literally. He says religion is the opiate of the masses, and it just has to be harnessed into the New World Order itself. Full spectrum dominance in the next chapter is the key that will lead to, and I'm not joking, that's what he says, it will lead to the phoenix from the ashes. So the New World Order, the new system that's arising, is the phoenix from the ashes. That's the meaning of this Masonic symbol of the great work. He says national governments, regional governments, local governments are all a scam because they promote the ideas of localism and regionalism, and all of this will have to be commandeered and tweaked and altered into the world government. He says, don't worry, in the last final stage there won't be any military, so this is not going to be some giant military force, because there won't be war. He says you're all going to be so drugged and turned into docile zombie golem creatures that you won't need it. They won't need a military, because why would any of these zombie creatures revolt? It's unthinkable. So, see, there won't be war. Oh man, so maybe. He also says that this doesn't have to be one giant monolithic system. He says as long as the people who are in these various systems and in various countries and in various organizations all have the same idea, who cares what your system is? As long as you're committed to the main points of globalism, they don't care what, whether you're some monarch or whether you're some republic or whether you're some democracy or whether you're a corporate head. Doesn't matter. Just have the same ideas that we have, and we're going to see what those ideas are. He basically lays out a kind of 10 commandments. I'm not kidding. He says, by the way, Wells says, this book that he's written, Open Conspiracy, and a couple other of his books, he says they are the Bibles of the New World Order. He says that about his books. This guy's like a megalomaniac here. What is the characteristic of a scientific world dictatorship? Chapter 8. It is worldwide liberation. So the scientism cult, he says, is an open psychological operation. This is page 46. This open psychological operation is a candid attempt to take possession of the whole world. They're not going to hide it. They're just going to openly say, here's what we're doing. What are the main features that it's going to lead to right away? Intelligent control of population, right away, number one. World economic controls. Direct breeding controls. Collective control of population. Reproductive impulses will eventually be done indirectly. In other words, test tube babies, GMO lab babies. Until that happens, until the science is advanced enough, he says, there will be eventually regulations on birth control, screwing people up sexually. So here you have the proto-social justice warrior here. And what you get in this chapter makes it very clear that it's social justice. Right? So these social justice warriors are the vanguard of the New World Order. Why? Because they're duped into thinking that they're standing up for freedom, but their freedom is actually the greatest form of slavery. That's what their controllers and handlers like H.G. Wells are saying. Literally, He's literally talking about the social gospel, which leads to the social justice warrior, leading to the screwed up psychosexual drives that lead to no offspring and no families. Again, what is the number one thing he wants to stop in this book? Family. Stop the family. The family will go the way of the dinosaur. Transport. You will live in the world will be under a central World Economic Bureau, a central intelligence bureau that will connect to all of the regional bureaus, which again can have different forms. They don't care what form the government itself takes, as long as it's a managerial arranged society and breeding is controlled. The religion is Darwinism, page 54. The dialectics of the one and the many, that is the individual versus the collective, will swing towards the collective. The many decades of touting atomistic individual liberty since the Enlightenment, and David Ricardo and Adam Smith and John Locke on all those characters as exactly what Aldous Huxley says, that will all be tossed away because you stupid idiots bought into the notion that your individual liberty was a real thing. That was all a plan to bring you into the pendulum swinging to the opposite end of the dialectic of total collectivism. And how many times have I said that you can't have a real coherent basis between balancing the one and the many without the right theology, right? Unless your theology, your Trinitarian theology, balances the one and the many, you're going to get screwed up one and the many relationships in the social order. Even Protestants have seen this. Even Rushton, he wrote a whole book on this called The One and the Many. And he's right in that book. All movement will be controlled, and that's because they have to control the flow of currency and goods in the world economic order. Private property will be largely done away with. There will be some allowances for, private enterprise or something like that, depending on the needs, but it's all going to be regulated. And why is that? Well, just because, simply put, man is an animal. Manimal, we'll call him. Manimal is just an evolutionary creature, part of a larger zoo. So, in their view, the New World Order is a giant zoo. Literally. Next chapter is the ideas of the New World Order. Marxism was useful, but as we've said many times, for H.G. Wells, he thinks that Marxism is limited. It's limiting. It's not enough, right? The totality of man is not class warfare. So the Marxists and the socialists have really limited themselves. However, he says they're very useful to the cause, but so are the global capitalists. The monopoly capitalists and the socialist Marxists are both sides of the dialectic that are great for the New World Order. That's a point that's made very clearly in Brave New World, right? The year of our Ford, right? Henry Ford, the great industrialist, takes the place of the Lord, and people are named after Karl Marx, right? One of the key characters is Bernard Marx, and that's because monopoly capitalism and international Marxism have the same end goals. So here on page 64, H.G. Wells again engages in the love fest with communism and Bolshevism and Marxism in Russia, and how great it was that this experiment was able to stamp out so many Christians. Literally. He says that eventually a bunch of oligarchs gained power in the Stalin period, but Stalin's 5-year plan can hopefully serve as a model for a future scientific dictatorship. I mean, you're talking about, this is why we say these Masonic guys like this are satanically motivated and inspired. I mean, here he is praising Bolsheviks and Soviets who murdered how many millions of Christians. And H.G. Wells says, well, that's what has to happen. You have to, I mean, what does the character in Dostoevsky's Demons say? Right? The socialist world revolution comes on on top of a pile of 100 million skulls before all that happened, before 1917. So, I mean, these people are maniacs, and they're possessed, and they're driven by these lunatic philosophies, genocidal philosophies. And that's why they think that nations all have to end. This is what he says on page 66. The New World Order is a war against all distinctions, identities, separate cultures, and nations. It is, in chapter 11, a war with all tradition. It is a new religion, literally. The West and Europe and the U.S. and Russia, he says, they all have too much tradition. He says he's happy to see that the Bolsheviks took down Russian tradition, and he's hopeful that his revolution can take down Europe and the West. That's what H.G. Wells says. Because there's too much tradition. So the U.S., he says, will either have to be ended, or it will just integrate into the New World Order, pages 72 and 73. He also has these diatribes on flags, where he can't stand any idea of patriotism or nationalism or people cohering, which shows, by the way, that many of my friends who virulently go against people groups out of the maybe anarchic tradition or libertarian tradition, you are loved by H.G. Wells. Right? He will actually say later on that the anarcho groups, the free trade groups, the libertarian groups are all very useful to the open conspiracy. What is all this? Well, this Wells says up to page 75. This is phase 1. Phase 1 is in patriotism and use class warfare. So this is the 30s. Okay, he's writing this in the 30s. People groups and nations aren't real. Why? Because evolution. Because it all changes. He says a bunch of oligarchs taking over is fine. We don't really have a problem with that, as long as they have the ideas of the open conspiracy and eventually lead things to the New World Order, page 77. So, in other words, this is a little more sophisticated than you might expect. I mean, H.G. Wells is no he's no idiot here. He's deft enough to understand that there's dialectics, and that certain movements that might not even in themselves be good or useful can, in the long run, be used. On page 78, marshal all education to end the family. So the key point for education will be he calls it propaganda to end the family. The Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 was key. It was the historical marker for the decapitating of kingdoms and the beginning of republics. This headlessness, right, was crucial to the beginning of the coming scientific technocratic dictatorship. Page 81. So he loves the Bolsheviks. He loves murderous lunatics. 82. Women must become professionals. They would have, if all women were in the workforce and were professionals, a lot more would get done. They would not be acting like children, and they would not be obsessed with womanly, mundane affairs and all this kind of stuff. Mechanization, he says, will be the key. This is what all the Marxists were said, that mechanization will lead to an end of labor. This is actually an interesting point. He cites basically the ideas of Plato's Republic and the Guardians, page 84. Eventually, we will do away with labor because the machines will do all the work. And then once there's no labor, all the dumb masses can be either sterilized, depopulated, euthanized, or used as part of large-scale scientific experiments. I'm not kidding. That's what his plan is. Okay. Now we're starting to see a consistent pattern of the same plan, aren't we? It's the same plan that Carroll Quigley talked about in his managerial society chapter, about the middle of Tragedy and Hope. It's the same plan as Bertrand Russell talked about. It's the same plan as Brzezinski talks about. It's the same plan that Jacques Attali talks about. They all have the same plan. See, it's not different, and so therefore there's one conspiracy. Proof. Because these are the guys who promote it and tweak it and formed it. Global capitalism, he says on page 88, will lead to the New World Order. It doesn't matter. There's plenty of Masons in CEOs and in corporate positions, so there's nothing inherently good about capitalism that's going to make it like the way to go as opposed to communism. Doesn't matter, he says. Doesn't matter. Russia, he says, has been completely decapitated and incorporated through Masonic systems since the 1700s. Exactly. It was Catherine the Great that introduced Masonry into Russia. So that's why Russia has gone downhill. It didn't just begin with 1917. Asiatic despotism in the East has been replaced in Russia with Bolshevism. And that's why the Soviets are so great. Many of the anarchists in Russia served a tremendously useful function in wrecking the existing order. The Soviets, he says, will win. I guess he was wrong about that because in a way he was right, because the Soviet system is just really being merged with the Western system. What the Bolsheviks were successful in doing was liberating mankind from monarchy. And the liberation from monarchy leads to the technocratic society. So you think. It was great, he says, that they had re-education camps. Millions of peasants were stamped out and put into re-education camps, and that was great. Page 92. And the Reds were awesome because they saw that the Christian peasantry had to be liquidated. So think about the kind of guy we're talking about here, right? This famous, supposedly awesome science fiction writer is licking his lips, cheering on the murder of millions of people. And yet we're told he's a literary hero. Race. This is interesting because the Fabians, you might be thinking, well, this sounds like Nazis. No, the Fabians aren't Nazis. However, the Fabians do have some ideas about which they liked and borrowed from Nazis. Or which Nazis borrowed from Fabians, either way. The point being that birth control, family planning, one-child policy or no-child policy, that's all what the Fabians prefer, and they just simply disagree with the idea of a single race even mattering. Because evolution is true, it's all evolving, you can't really even strictly define a race anyway, according to H.G. Wells. And the whole ideas of races is kind of tied up with the ideas of distinct cultures and traditions, and that all has to die. And so, because we're going into the GMO test tube babies in the future, race isn't even going to matter. Okay, so you have to understand that this is the Fabian model that's been adopted. So they don't care about white people, don't care about any of that stuff. Right? It's not a Nazi plan, it's a Fabian plan. New World Order, this is a weird chapter, is natural, necessary, it will 100% happen, and it already owns you. It's not a thing that you get to decide about, Wells says. Wells says if you're reading this already owns you. Think about that. He says it will require you to undergo a kind of religious conversion. Page 99, 98 and 99. It will be viewed as a religion, and it will require religious devotion. So when you watch THX 1138 and Robert Duvall goes in and he does confession to the AI bot Jesus, that's what H.G. Wells is talking about. Literally. He says the psychoanalysts, and of course ultimately there will be an AI version of this, they will replace the religious confessional, exactly what you see in THX, and the New World Order itself will be the God of the Deus Ex Machina, right? The God from within the system. The psychoanalysts will be the new confessors, and you will be required to submit to this. So wait a minute, I thought we were done with religious tradition and superstition, and I thought that the ancient medieval church was this domineering force of dogma and stamping people out and murdering people and holding man's conscience, right, in hostage. But now wait a minute. Now H.G. Wells is saying all those things are going to be done by the New World Order religion. So, in other words, we've all been duped here for hundreds of years. We've been sold a lie that we will be liberated. And then here, the scientific dictatorship is coming uncloaked, literally, and saying, ha 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 ha, you thought we were here to liberate you. No, we were here to put you in even worse chains. And in fact, everything that you thought that the church was evil and mean about, we're going to do 10 times worse. You thought people died in the Crusades, was probably, a few thousand, maybe? Oh, we're actually going to kill millions of people. You thought your conscience was in bondage to confession? Oh, we're actually going to, through AI, hate speech, retroactive fines, etc., prison, we're going to find your thoughts. We're going to imprison you for thought crime. Think about that. So you thought you were getting freedom, and all your scientism propagandists and evangelists out there, Dawkins and Hitchens, and trying to preach to you all this freedom, they're selling you the H.G. Wells gospel. They're agents of the same conspiracy as H.G. Wells. And so you're going to learn, unless you turn from this stuff, you're going to get the scientific dictatorship, and it's going to be a nightmare. He says, we're not going to worry about older people. He says, we will infiltrate schools and education, and we will get the young. Page 108, 109. He says, if you want three easy principles for this, he said, I'm going to give it to you. Here's the laws. Here's the first three great commandments of H.G. Wells' New World Order Bible. First, all existing governments are provisional. Do not have loyalty to them. It's interesting that he puts that one first. Number 2, control population. Number 3, if we drift towards a World War II, we must be concerned. He's talking about drifting towards World War II. He says the concern must be to avoid patriotism. So the first 3 laws of H.G. Wells are stop patriotism, stop the idea of having children, and stop patriotism. So he repeats it. Who will be recruited into the open conspiracy New World Order? And again, for him, he's saying that all we need to do is put the idea out there and let it spread. It doesn't even have to be everybody joining some secret society. Now, H.G. Wells himself was part of a secret society, but he's saying, you don't have to come to me and go undergo something. Just agree to my ideas. That's all we need. All we need is for you to agree to some basic ideas, and you're part of the open conspiracy. And in that way, we can infect all organizations and institutions just through mass propaganda. That's why H.G. Wells was a propagandist. But it has to also be done through direct recruitment. How do we do that? Well, through small little good works. So here's your do-gooders. Little good works like making sure that local libraries have globalist books. Making sure that public schools have globalist books. where can we recruit our foot soldiers? Well, he says, go to the League of Nations and ultimately to the United Nations, and the do-gooders there will be great. Go to Margaret Sanger's birth control movement. Go to all the radical socialist and communist societies, and there we will find all of our ready adherents. That's where to recruit. What do they need to do first? First of all, he says, promote pacifism. Now, I'm not saying that this means that war is good, right? So the question isn't, are you pro-war or anti-war? What H.G. Wells is saying is that pacifism as a 100% principle will be promoted at all times and in all cases, because that leads to the weakening of the society. Page 111. He says, saying you're anti-war, okay, so what? It doesn't matter unless you're saying you're anti-war to promote global government. That's the only way in which being anti-war is useful. So there's your 3 commandments, as I said, but he also gives 7 more commandments. So you kind of get a 10 commandments here from H.G. Wells, and some of these are just restatements anyway. But what are the 10 commandments of H.G. Wells? Well, we saw the first 3. Next, again, restated, governments are provisional and must be done away. That is national local governments. So just at least have this idea in your mind that these are all passing away. Work to minimize all argument, all conflict, and all difference between systems, right? So in other words, praxis, in other words, get everyone into just agreeing. All right, so don't allow real discussion, real reasoned argument or debate. Just enforce agreement and compromise, he says. Point 3, replace all private, local, and national ownerships with a world directorate. So private property, private business, get rid of all that. Number 4, world biological controls of population, disease, and the erection of a World Health Council. In other words, the World Health Organization and the UN. So all of that came to pass. Universal basic income. Wow. 0.5, according to H.G. Wells. What do you hear Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk talking about? That very thing. Supreme duty of subordinating your career ideals to the world directorate. In other words, you don't get to choose what you want to be when you grow up. You will have an assigned task. And point number 7, the recognition that the worship of immortality, I'm not joking, this is what he says, the worship of immortality does not apply to anybody individually. You must have just a generic worship and faith in the immortality of the human race as a whole, and that's what you're committed to. So the doctrine of resurrection of Christ has been transferred into belief in the generic immortality of the human race, and that's the replacement for the Christian idea of resurrection. Weird. But I mean, that's perfectly in line with Masonry. So next chapter, all nationalism must die. And he says that, this is very instructive, he says that the socialists were idiots because they opposed anti-imperialism. He says the capitalists that built the giant international empire, that's the means by which the global government will come. So, dear Marxists, dear socialists, why are you fighting imperialism, modern imperialism, when that's what's going to bring the global government that you're fighting for? Right? I mean, how many Marxists are idiots, can't grasp that? And how many times have I been saying that? I've said that since like age 23, since I learned this from my Marxist professors. Science is the goal. Scientism is the religion of the future. It is the New World Order plan, and it's international, and that's why it will succeed. Quote, pure science is the search for biological and physical realities. The Royal Society is a model for this global scientism, pages 120, 121. This Businesses, industry, because they want and strive to be international, they're useful for this world order. Yeah, exactly. How many times do we have to say that? Private ownership is a mere stage towards the socialist world order. This is a key Marxist idea that he does agree with. He says eventually when the world order is in place, all the, quote, capitalism stuff will be discarded. Suitable population control measures will be instituted. Austerity will come into play. The bankers imposing austerity is 100% in line with H.G. Wells' plan. This will introduce uniformity and a global economic reconstruction. This leads to full spectrum dominance, and the key, again, he says, to this is to link all areas and understand it as a full spectrum plan and to change education. I love page 126 and 127. That's where he says explicitly that the libertarians, the anarchists, the free trade, liberal economic theorists, and the pacifists are all 100% useful to the power of subversion leading to Wells's New World Order. So those actions of subversions on the part of libertarians and free trade proponents and liberal economic theorists and pacifists all contribute to the destruction of all local and existing powers and authorities that will lead to the integration into the global order. Pacifism is key. Again, not because wars are always good or that taking an anti-war stance is bad. I take an anti-war stance to these modern wars. That's not what H.G. Wells is talking about. H.G. Wells is saying that pacifism is key as a tool to make everybody feel bad and then surrender to the global order. Being anti-war, as he says, is only useful insofar as you promote the New World Order. What are the key theses of the New World Order? It is a world movement that will swallow up the entire population of the world into one global community. This will lead to dysgenics, weapons of mass migration, pages 128, 129. Another criticism of the Marxists and socialists is that his vision is much wider. They were too stupid to not understand full spectrum dominance. Monopoly capitalism is a huge aid in the system being erected. He says new schools will be erected in the future. Okay, this is chapter 8, 17. There will be a new way to do families. Here's your social justice warriors, right? New relations of human beings to one another. Public education will be a giant lab experiment. There will be the erection of gifted schools, so you'll have two kinds of education. The mass people will be educated into the public stupid stuff, the retard stuff. This is what what Bertrand Russell says as well in his books. The smarter people, smarter kids will be brought to gifted schools. I was brought to one of these gifted schools when I was a kid out in California, big UNESCO plan. Gifted schools for intelligent children. The rest will be given a stupid education, and they'll not be told any of this stuff. They'll be kept in the dark. And towards the end of the book, we come to the conclusion. His message to the Marxists is stop fighting imperialism. Imperialists are building the New World Order that he wants. Dear Marxist idiot, imperialism is how the New World Order will be built. Duh. He says, how else do you think the technocracy comes into power? If not through globo-capitalism. Global capitalism builds the smart city. And then global capitalism gets tossed away as an old dead carcass that was useful at one time. And out of the ashes, out of that carcass, emerges the New World Order beast. The New World Order will win over the world, he says, because no one will believe it. No one will believe that there's an actual plan to do this, page 146, 147, and so therefore it will succeed. As a result, many people in religious traditions and in national governments will die, but that's just the way of the world. Sorry. This open conspiracy will lead to many people being put to death who promote the conspiracy, but ultimately it will be successful because of its grand vision and because it promotes liberation. Now, wait a minute. It doesn't promote liberation for everybody, does it? No. You're going to die, but you're going to die for a good purpose. The purpose is the future elites of the New World Order. So man has given up dying for an eternal religious cause, only to be duped by these con men into believing that they're giving their lives for a future utopia that they will have no part in. And that's even what H.G. Wells says. Yeah, you won't have a part in this, but, I mean, isn't it better to die for something than nothing? And what is that something? Star Trek. I'm not joking. The last section is, man will have Star Trek. You're going to be Captain Kirk. Well, you won't be Captain Kirk on other planets sleeping with hot green alien women. We will. Our descendants will. You will, unfortunately, just go back into the earth as a meaningless evolutionary process that you were. We will go into the future, hopefully resurrected, cloned, or whatever, in his view, enjoying satanic rituals on Mars or Zeta Reticuli, whatever he thinks is going to happen in the Star Trek world. So that is the open conspiracy. That's the total. Again, what are we seeing here? We're seeing a unified plan. Unified plan over decades and centuries. Unified plan that at least is here stretching back to the Royal Society and these characters. Now, I'm not saying that the Royal Society had all of this completely figured out, in the time of Bacon and New Atlantis or whatever, but this is the common fount from which we're drawing this fetid water. And it's all laid out here in this 150-page book from 1935. Again, note as well the similarity of the time period, right? 1930s, post World War I, post Bolshevik Revolution, pre World War II, and these are the guys promoting the League of Nations, and it's not doing exactly what they hoped for, but they're not really that concerned about the League of Nations. They're looking ahead. This is a long-term plan, right? So that's the key here. These guys are thinking long-term, and in the theological tradition of the West and in Orthodoxy, we used to think long-term, but all this consumerism has trained us to think short-term. So we don't think about where our descendants are going to be worshiping 500 years from now, most of the time. Some of us do. But that's, of course, why, according to H.G. Wells, tradition and family has to be destroyed. Once we start thinking about, for example, having a nice church for our great-great-great-grandkids to worship in, then we've defeated the New World Order. So all of that has to be destroyed, according to H.G. Wells. So here you have it, another one of these satanic Luciferian characters, a promoter and supporter of the Bolshevik Revolution, a propagandist, a Royal Society clique member here, outer portico guy here. Maybe he was an inner illuminist. He could be, given his similarities with Weishaupt. But there you go. Pure evil.